I told myself the hike was about fresh air and silence, about escaping the dull pressure of routine that had settled over my life like dust. That was the story I repeated when I packed my bag, when I locked the apartment door, and when I texted Maya that I'd be out of signal for a day or two. She replied with a heart emoji and a reminder to be careful. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt distant. Lucas arrived just after sunrise, his old SUV humming softly as it pulled up. He stepped out with the same easy smile he'd worn since college, the kind that made people feel instantly at ease. Lucas had been my best friend for nearly a decade, the person who knew my habits, my flaws, and the jokes I never bothered to explain. Being around him required no performance, no explanations. That comfort was exactly why I'd suggested the hike. The drive to the trailhead was filled with familiar rhythms. We talked about work, about a movie we never finished, about nothing important at all. Yet beneath the casual conversation, I felt an unusual alertness, as if my senses had quietly sharpened. I noticed the way Lucas drummed his fingers on the steering wheel when he was thinking, the way his voice softened when he spoke about leaving the city behind. These were things I'd seen 100 times before, but now they seemed newly vivid. When we reached the trail, the world narrowed to earth and trees. The forest greeted us with a deep, patient quiet, broken only by birds and the crunch of our boots. Lucas walked ahead at an unhurried pace, glancing back occasionally to make sure I was keeping up. I realized how little effort it took to follow him, how natural it felt to fall into step beside him. As the path climbed, conversation thinned, replaced by breath and movement. The physical exertion grounded me, but it also stripped away distractions. Without my phone buzzing or Maya's name appearing on the screen, my thoughts drifted to uncomfortable places. I wondered when my relationship had begun to feel like an obligation rather than a choice. I wondered why that question felt sharper here, walking beside Lucas, than it ever did at home. We stopped at a clearing to rest, sunlight spilling through the canopy in scattered patterns. Lucas handed me a bottle of water, our fingers brushing briefly. The contact was accidental, insignificant by any rational measure, yet it lingered in my awareness longer than it should have. I laughed it off, making a joke about needing more breaks than I used to. Lucas smiled, but his eyes held a curiosity that unsettled me. "You've been quiet," he said, not accusing, just observant. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, then slowed my words. "Just enjoying the quiet." He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. That was one of Lucas's gifts. He never forced confessions, but somehow people offered them anyway. As we sat there, he spoke about his own restlessness, about feeling like life was moving forward without his permission. He didn't frame it as unhappiness, just a sense of being paused. I listened, recognizing pieces of myself in his words. The trail grew narrower after the clearing, demanding more attention. At one steep section, I slipped on loose gravel. Lucas turned instantly, steadying me with a firm hand on my arm. For a moment, neither of us moved. His grip was practical, necessary, but the closeness carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I thanked him and stepped back, pretending the moment had been nothing. As afternoon edged toward evening, we reached the spot where we planned to set up camp. The air cooled, shadows stretching across the ground. Lucas began unloading gear, focused and efficient. I watched him, struck by an unfamiliar thought that made me uneasy. This felt easier than it should, more right than I was prepared to admit. When the tent was finally up and the light began to fade, a quiet realization settled over me. This hike was no longer just an escape from routine. Something subtle had shifted, something I didn't yet have words for. As night approached and the forest deepened into silence, I sensed that the hardest part of the journey was only beginning. Night settled over the campsite with a quiet certainty, as if the forest itself had decided to listen. The fire Lucas built was modest, just enough to push back the dark and warm our hands. We sat across from each other, knees drawn close, the space between us smaller than it had been all day. The flames reflected in Lucas's eyes, making his expression harder to read. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. Food. Plans for the next stretch of the trail. Stories from the past we'd told each other before. Yet the conversation kept circling back, drifting toward heavier truths neither of us named outright. The silence between sentences grew longer, more deliberate. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. Lucas broke it first. Do you ever feel like you're living on autopilot? His voice was calm, but the question carried weight that I considered lying, offering a casual answer that would keep everything simple. Instead, I stared into the fire and told him the truth. More often than I'd like to admit. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that. Lucas spoke about waking up every day knowing he was supposed to be grateful, knowing his life looked fine from the outside, yet feeling strangely detached from it. He didn't mention relationships, but I sensed there was more beneath his words. Listening to him, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore, a recognition that felt dangerously intimate that I thought of Maya then, sitting alone in our apartment, trusting me enough not to worry. The thought should have anchored me. Instead, it filled me with a dull ache. I realized how rarely I spoke to her this honestly, how carefully I chose my words around her now. With Lucas, the truth seemed to surface on its own. My phone vibrated in my pocket, breaking the moment. A message from Maya, asking if we'd reached camp safely. I replied with a brief reassurance, careful not to let Lucas see the screen. When I put the phone away, guilt settled heavily in my chest. Lucas noticed the shift in my mood but didn't ask. That restraint felt kinder than curiosity. The fire crackled as the night deepened. The temperature dropped, and without thinking, Lucas scooted closer, offering to share his jacket. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting. The gesture was practical, innocent even, but the closeness made my thoughts race. I became acutely aware of his presence, of the steady rhythm of his breathing. Neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary and dangerous at the same time. At one point, Lucas laughed softly and shook his head. "It's strange," he said. "How easy this feels." I knew exactly what he meant, and that knowledge scared me. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "It is." As the fire burned low, we prepared to turn in. The campsite was small, the tents close. Lucas paused before ducking inside his, looking at me with an expression that hovered between hesitation and resolve. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "So am I answered, and meant it more deeply than I should have. Inside my tent, sleep refused to come. My mind replayed the evening in fragments, Lucas's voice, the brush of fabric, the unspoken understanding that had settled between us. I told myself nothing had happened. There had been no clear line crossed, no moment I could point to and label as betrayal. Yet I couldn't ignore the truth forming in my chest. My thoughts, my attention, my emotions had already shifted away from where they were supposed to belong. That I realized then that infidelity didn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as comfort and understanding. As the forest hummed softly around us, I lay awake knowing that whatever awaited us the next day, I could no longer pretend this hike was just a harmless escape. Something essential had changed, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face what it would demand of me. Morning arrived without relief. Adam woke before the alarm, his thoughts already active, circling the same uneasy truths he had avoided the night before. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that invited reflection rather than rest. He lay still, listening to Mark's breathing beside him, and felt the sharp contrast between physical closeness and emotional distance. Nothing visible had changed, yet Adam sensed that the foundation beneath their marriage had shifted. Over breakfast, Adam spoke less than usual. Mark noticed but said nothing, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fatigue. Their routines continued as they always had, coffee poured, doors closed, goodbyes exchanged, but the familiarity felt fragile now, like something that could crack under a careless word. Adam watched Mark leave and wondered how long silence could serve as protection before it turned into betrayal. Ethan stayed out of sight for the next few days, which only intensified Adam's awareness of him. Absence proved more disruptive than presence. Adam replayed their conversation, the careful way Ethan had offered him a choice rather than an escape. That restraint haunted him. It made Adam question his own motives, the quiet longing that had drawn him towards someone who asked so little yet seemed to understand so much. When they finally met again, it was unplanned. Adam was returning home early, his thoughts scattered, when he found Ethan in the hallway. There was no pretense this time, no small talk to soften the moment. They exchanged a brief greeting, and Adam felt the tension settle between them, familiar and unresolved. Ethan spoke first, his tone steady but sincere. He acknowledged the risk of what they were doing, the cost it could carry for both of them. He said he didn't want to become a secret that damaged a life already under strain. The words struck Adam with unexpected force, because they echoed the doubts he had tried to ignore. Ethan wasn't offering romance or rescue, only honesty. Adam responded with more truth than he intended. He admitted that the distance in his marriage had left him feeling invisible, that being seen again had felt like a reminder of something he'd lost. He did not excuse his feelings, but he did not deny them either. Saying the words aloud made them real in a way thoughts never had. They parted without resolution, but not without understanding. Adam returned to his apartment aware that clarity, not temptation, was now his greatest challenge. He could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Emotional lines, once crossed, did not reset simply because no one was watching. That evening, Mark asked a question he had avoided for weeks. He wanted to know whether Adam was still happy. The simplicity of it left Adam unprepared. He considered offering reassurance, the practiced answer that would preserve peace, but something in him resisted. For the first time in a long while, Adam chose honesty, even though it frightened him. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the distance between them without assigning blame. Mark listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Adam finished, the space between them felt heavier, but also more real. Mark admitted he had felt the change too, though he hadn't known how to name it. There was pain in his voice, but also a willingness to confront what they had both avoided. The conversation did not resolve their marriage, but it altered its direction. They agreed to take time, to talk more, to listen differently, to stop pretending that stability alone was enough. Adam did not mention Ethan by name, but the shadow of that truth lingered, unspoken yet present. Later, alone in his room, Adam reflected on the choices unfolding before him. Infidelity, he realized, was not defined by a single act, but by the gradual turning away from one truth toward another. He stood at a crossroads shaped by desire, honesty, and consequence, unsure which path would demand more courage. As night settled in, Adam understood that change had already begun, not because of what had happened, but because of what could no longer be ignored. Whatever came next would require him to decide who he wanted to be, not in secret, but in the open light of accountability. The room was the same, the silence familiar, yet Adam sensed that the story was far from over. Weeks passed, measured not by dates but by small adjustments. I learned how quiet my apartment could be without Maya's routines filling the gaps. The silence no longer startled me, but it demanded attention. Every evening, I faced the same question I had avoided for years: what did I actually want, when no one else's expectations were guiding me? Lucas and I didn't speak for a while. The distance was intentional, a boundary we both respected. I told myself it was necessary, that clarity required space. Still, his presence lingered in ordinary moments, in the songs that played during my commute, in the memory of how easily words had come to us on the trail. I wasn't longing for him in a simple way. I was reckoning with what he represented, honesty without performance. When Lucas finally reached out, it was with a short message asking how I was doing. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, aware that my reply mattered. I answered truthfully, telling him I was figuring things out, that it wasn't easy, but it felt real. His response was immediate and gentle. He said he was glad. He said he was doing the same. We met for coffee a few days later, choosing a quiet place where conversation wouldn't have to compete with noise. Seeing him again felt different from the hike. The intensity had softened, replaced by a steadier understanding. Lucas looked relaxed, as if releasing the need to wait for me had freed him in some way. That realization eased something in my chest. That we spoke openly, not about what could have happened, but about what had changed. I told him about the space Maya and I were taking, about how painful honesty had been, and how necessary it felt. Lucas listened, just as he always had, without steering me toward any conclusion. When I asked him what he wanted, he smiled faintly and said he wanted whatever didn't require either of us to hide. That answer stayed with me long after we parted. It echoed during solitary walks and sleepless nights. I realized that the hike hadn't created feelings out of nothing. It had exposed a truth I'd been postponing. My life, as it was, demanded compromise that no longer felt fair to anyone involved. Eventually, Maya and I met again, not to revisit old wounds, but to close them properly. We spoke with a clarity that had been missing before, acknowledging the care we still had for each other and the reasons it wasn't enough. The conversation was difficult, but it lacked bitterness. We didn't frame it as failure. We framed it as honesty arriving late, but still arriving. Standing alone afterward, I felt a mix of loss and relief. The path ahead wasn't defined, but it was mine to choose. That realization brought a quiet confidence I hadn't felt before. Lucas and I continued to talk, slowly, without rushing toward labels or promises. We were careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for what we'd learned. Whatever grew between us did so on open ground, without secrecy. That difference mattered more than intensity ever had. Sometimes, I think back to the moment I first suggested the hike, believing it would be an escape. I understand now that it was never about leaving. It was about arriving at a truth I could no longer avoid. Not every journey ends with certainty, but some give you the courage to stop pretending, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.